Good evening to everyone joining us here in the US, and good morning to all of our friends joining us in China and throughout Asia. Welcome to today's event, The Next Frontier in Chinese Energy and Environmental Policy. My name is Sam Ori. I'm the Executive Director of the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago and also the Becker-Friedman Institute for Economics at the University of Chicago. Before we begin, I just have a few housekeeping items. To listen to today's program in Mandarin, click on the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen and select Chinese. And please feel free to use the Q&A function to submit questions in either English or Chinese throughout the event. I'd like to invite all of the panelists for today's event to turn on their video. And I will introduce the theme of today's discussion, and then I'll introduce each of our excellent panelists. Over the past several years, China has made ambitious commitments and swift progress on several energy and environmental goals. For example, between 2013 and 2018, concentrations of small particulate air pollution, the most significant pollutant for human health, fell by nearly 40% on average in China, with larger reductions in key regions. However, continued progress is essential, and Chinese policymakers have signaled that future policies must carefully balance cleaner air and other goals with cost effectiveness. In 2019, the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago and the University of the Chinese Academy of Sciences joined together to form the Joint Center for Energy Policy Research in China. This unique partnership aims to support joint research at the frontier of understanding and addressing key energy and environmental questions and challenges in China. Today, we'll hear from experts as they discuss the important work being undertaken by the EPIC-UCAS Joint Center and hear key insights from a few of its inaugural set of projects which were just announced last year. So let me begin by introducing our first, one of our first presenters, our second presenter actually, and our moderator for the discussion today, University of Chicago Professor Michael Greenstone. Michael Greenstone is the Milton Friedman Distinguished Service Professor in Economics, as well as the Director of the Becker-Friedman Institute for Economics and the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago. He previously served as the Chief Economist for President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, where he co-led the development of the United States government's social cost of carbon. Michael's research is focused on uncovering the benefits and costs of environmental quality and society's energy choices. Our first speaker will be Professor Zhangbo Hu. Zhangbo Hu is a professor of material science at the University of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, also known as UCAS. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, he served as a postdoctoral scholar, research scientist at Argonne National Laboratory here in Chicago, a national lab that's also managed by the University of Chicago, and was a senior energy engineer at ComEd in Chicago. Professor Hu is interested in sustainability, the circular economy, and the societal aspects of material science. After Professor Hu and Professor Greenstone give some introductory remarks, we'll have a panel that will feature two additional faculty members. First will be Fiona Berlig. Fiona Berlig is an assistant professor at UChicago's Harris School of Public Policy and a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. She studies energy and environmental economics with a focus on the developing world. Prior to joining Harris, Fiona was a postdoctoral scholar in the Department of Economics and the Energy Policy Institute, EPIC. Finally, we have Xiaoda Wang. Xiaoda is a postdoctoral scholar and the Liang Family Fellow at EPIC. In July 2021, he will join the faculty of the Harris School of Public Policy. He's an applied economist with research interests in development economics, environmental economics, and political economy. His main research agenda aims at understanding the political economy of public policy with a particular focus on China. Now, I would like to invite Professor Hu to provide some context and speak about our joint collaboration with UCAS. Professor Hu, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, good morning, good morning and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great honor to have this chance to briefly talk about the UCAS and the EPIC Joint Center for Energy Policy Research in China. The University of Chinese Academy of Sciences and the University of Chicago, on behalf of its EPIC, signed an MOU for establishing the Joint Center in January of 2019. And we want to do this because the energy and the environmental issues are global issues that can only be faced or be solved. Any problem, any global issues can, or any global problems can only be solved through the international cooperation. We believe that. And also on the other side, energy and the environmental issues are not just technical issues. In many cases, the policies and the laws and the regulations play even more critical role in energy and environmental issues, like all this climate change, environmental degradation, depleting fossil fuels, all are global issues. This kind of problem can only be solved by international cooperation. It is of great significance to establish the Joint Center study on the strategic attributes of energy and the environmental. From the very beginning, both the University of Chinese Academy of Sciences and the Chinese Academy of Science itself attach great importance to the UCAS EPIC Joint Center for Energy Policy Research in China. When talk about this Joint Center, the UCAS President Li Shusen, Professor Li Shusen, is also the Vice President for Chinese Academy of Sciences. He mentioned that UCAS and CAS's scientific and engineering expertise combined with the University of Chicago's global leadership in economic analysis will create new ideas, new solutions that can't be generated in other ways. So very exciting when you talk about this Joint Center. And so far, both UCAS and the CAS itself has provided special fund and other resources to support the running of this Joint Center. We launched the first stage of joint project last year, and so far have achieved some phased result. For example, we learned something about from the study on policy and the strategy study on distributed renewable energy application in Taipei, in Qinghai Taipei Plateau. We also get some result on study of a renewable energy transportation strategy from the resource intensive area to the population intensive area. We also learned something from gap analysis of incentive policies to scale renewable energy. All the studies are ongoing and report are preparing right now. Some other important results related to the Joint Center are also achieved. For example, our co-leader, Professor Michael Greenstone and his team released the AQLI report 2020, which is, of course, with very significant impact in this field in the world. Now also another co-leader, Professor Shi Chunfeng, together with the CAS President, Professor Bai Chunli, the Vice President of CAS, Professor Zhang Tao, he's in charge of energy research in CAS system, and the Director of Chinese National Foundation of Science, Nature Science, Professor Li Jinhai, they published a perspective article titled as Powering the Future with Liquid Sunshine. As you all know, our president told the world last year, he said that China will scale up its intended national determined contribution by adopting more vigorous policies and measures. China will ensure greenhouse gas emission peak before 2030 and then reach the carbon neutrality before 2060. And in order to achieve these goals, both technological progress and the policy support are very important. And of course, I believe our Joint Center will play an important role in this progress. We believe with continued efforts, the UCAS EPIC Joint Center will be able to provide new approach, new perspective, and the new solutions for policymakers in China and the rest of the world to address major priorities of energy and the environment. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, John Bo. And we're very excited to be partnering with you. That was terrific. Michael Greenstone, maybe some remarks on the Global Energy Challenge and some framing of the panel.
Okay, so look, it's just wonderful to be here to celebrate the Beijing Center. It's wonderful to be here to talk about EPIC China, and it is especially wonderful to be here and share this venue with my good friend John Bo and talk about some of the work that we're doing, and we're going to talk more about it on the panel. I thought I would try and frame the whole thing a little bit by talking about the global energy challenge, which is something that animates EPIC's work throughout the world, and animates it especially so with respect to China. And so there's this, let's see if my slides will advance. There we go. This picture, it's not ours. It comes from the Guardian newspaper. It's an iconic picture from Beijing, and it's just showing the difference between a very clean day with low air pollution day in Beijing and a more polluted one. And I think it helps illustrate what I think of as the global energy challenge in a very clear way, which is that societies are struggling around the world to really achieve three things with respect to energy. The first is, how do you get access to inexpensive and reliable sources of energy that unlock all of this economic growth that you can see of the cars driving and the tall, beautiful buildings and the iconic building in Beijing? All of that has, emerged in Beijing, or become amplified in Beijing in the last couple decades in ways that people couldn't have imagined, 20 years ago. And that was powered by access to inexpensive and reliable energy. So that's like the first leg of what I think of as a stool. The second leg of the stool is that same energy consumption, which unlocked all this economic growth, can, if not managed correctly, produce days like this. And those are days when there are health problems. Those are days that are just unpleasant to be around. And so how do you have all this economic growth and energy consumption without setting off really urgent local health environmental problems? And then the third leg of the stool is that the same energy that unlocks this growth and can lead to this air pollution, primarily fossil fuels, you can't see it, but you know it's there, which is it involves the release of CO2. And how are the societies going to find a way to manage the risks posed by climate change? So the global energy challenge, as I think about it, is every society in the world, and China is no exception, and the issues are, I think, most interesting and most important and most urgent in China and a couple other places around the world, are trying to find a balance between those three goals. And so let me just talk about this a little bit with a little more specificity as it relates to China. So I think no conversation about China can really should miss the point that the reduction in poverty that has been achieved in China in the last 3 decades is without historical precedent. I think it's the most important economic event globally in the last couple centuries, and it's just truly remarkable. How did that happen? Well, it was many factors, but it's absolutely would not have happened without a very sharp increase in energy consumption. Now, one thing I'll note is that energy consumption continues in China and in the United States and many other parts of the world to be heavily reliant on fossil fuels. And it's those fossil fuels that produce that air pollution and that produce CO2. So that's, kind of the first thing. We got to have a continued economic growth in China. We've got to have it everywhere in the world. It's going to involve lots of energy consumption. That is going to come bundled, unless there's policy to prevent it, with lots of local air pollution and consequences for human health. And I think when you start to talk about China on this issue, another aspect of, and this of its more recent past, not the last 3 decades, but really the last 6 or 7 years, has been the very striking reduction in PM, particulate matter air pollution, that has followed since China declared a war on air pollution in 2013. And so in 2013, average PM 2.5 concentrations were about 55.3 micrograms per cubic meter, more than 5.5 times the WHO standard. Obviously, in certain areas was even higher. The JJJ region is an important one. So that's 2013. And what's amazing is the very sharp reduction that has occurred since then. On average, this is using satellite data from the whole country, on average, PM pollution concentrations have fallen by almost 40%. And the JJJ region is no exception to that rule. And those reductions in air pollution, based on some research that I've conducted, and if they were sustained, will increase the life expectancy of the average person in China by about 2 years. Be higher in some places than in others, and this map kind of details this. And there has never been, just as there was never such a sharp increase in reduction in poverty rates, there's never been such a sharp reduction in air pollution, at least that I'm aware of with available data sources. And so that has, the consequence of that has been great reductions in concentrations of air pollution in China, but there's still more work to be done, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Then, of course, there's climate change, and that, I think, we are all, as Professor Hu, my friend Jung Bo said, in this together, especially so with climate change. And I think here, this is just reporting emissions in 2010, projected emissions in 2050, and projected emissions in 2100 this is prior to China's announcement, but kind of under a business as usual scenario. And the only point is, like, the United States, China, India, and a few other places play central roles in whether or not in the degree of climate change that we're all going to have to face. And that's illustrated here by just the share of cumulative greenhouse gas emissions in, as I said, 2010, 2050, and 2100. And so by the end of the century, China is projected to account for about a quarter. And there's no question that Chinese policymakers are aware of all these issues and grappling with them. They have set, this is from the previous 5-year plan, I think new goals have not been set yet, on reductions in air pollution in key cities. And this figure just illustrates the gains that would be available if those reductions are achieved and sustained. There is, of course, the Xi Jinping's very important announcement that kind of, I think, helped reset the international table with respect to climate, where he announced that China would be carbon neutral by 2060. And all I want to highlight is those two very important environmental goals are going to have to be balanced with the urgent need for continued economic growth. And I think that's going to require and present opportunities for finding policies that are able to do a good job balancing the need for all three legs of the global energy challenge. And we think that research can play an important part of that. And specifically, how can research contribute? It looks like Jung Bo and I had the same picture. But one important way, I think, is through this partnership that we are so proud of having set up and continuing to work together with UCAS on the Joint Center for Energy Policy Research in China. That has birthed a series of very exciting projects that are bringing Chicago researchers together with researchers in China. Some of the areas that people have been focusing on or are already working on, understanding how China's air pollution alert system affects economic activity, air pollution and public health, evaluating the benefits of China's recent reform of its heating policy, measuring the effect that tougher environmental inspections have on firm performance and the cost of compliance, and estimating the impact of improved air quality monitoring on firm productions and emissions outcomes. And this is just the beginning. I think we expect many flowers to bloom out of this. So with that, let me just say thank you. And I'm excited to be here and excited to get to our All-Star Panel. So Sam has introduced everyone. We have this really terrific panel. Shada and Fiona are rising star professors at the University of Chicago. Shada, we can't, he's been a postdoc for 2 years. We cannot wait till he's actually fully on campus all the time. So Fiona is an assistant professor at the Harris School. And one thing that I think is really terrific about the collaboration with UCAS and with EPIC China is that it has drawn, I think, a lot of faculty at American universities would like to work on China and just don't really know how. And one thing we try to do with EPIC China and the relationship with UCAS is make it easier to do so. And so, Fiona, you're a recent recipient of an EPIC-UCAS Joint Center inaugural funding award to study the effects of air pollution alert systems. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that project and what you plan to do with it, and just enlighten people on your thinking.
Yeah, definitely. First of all, thanks for having me. It's super exciting to get to be part of this celebration of the center, as well as the beginning of this kind of ongoing collaboration between EPIC and UCAS. Like you just suggested, Michael, I'm kind of a new person to working on China. Most of my work so far has been on India and the US. But I think working in China provides a really exciting opportunity to address some of the most pressing challenges in energy and the environment in a way that really we haven't had that much opportunity to study before. And so the project that I'm working on with several others, including Shada and Michael, as well as Koichiro Ito and some collaborators from UCAS as well, is investigating a large-scale program designed to reduce pollution in China, which is the Chinese Pollution Alert System. So the idea here is that we're really concerned about days on which particulate matter concentrations are extremely high. And so in order to address that, the Chinese government has a system where if pollution forecasts suggest that it's going to be a very, very high pollution day, they'll issue an alert and engage with local firms to reduce economic activity for a short period of time in order to bring down those pollution concentrations. The goal here being to improve public health in a way that also isn't incredibly costly for those firms. What's interesting is that this pollution alert system has multiple gradations or different levels of severity. So we can have an okay day, a emerging or sort of concerning day, and then a really, really bad day. And the way that this system is set up is depending on whether we're forecasted to be sort of green, yellow, or red, different firms in the economy will be engaged to pull back on production. So what that allows us to do is really look into this relationship between shutting down for a little bit and economic productivity of those firms. So we can measure nicely this trade-off between the growth that Michael was talking about that's really key to continuing to improve economic well-being of China's citizens and improvements in pollution. And thinking about that at different levels of pollution as well provides us with new insights into both the costs of pollution and therefore the benefits of pollution abatement, as well as impacts on different sectors of the economy. And one of the things that I'm really excited about working in China is this is a large-scale policy that's affecting multiple cities. And so taking a look at this policy potentially provides us and UCAS with a joint opportunity to really improve outcomes for lots and lots of people. As well as kind of as the researcher in me is also very excited about a wealth of new data that's available in China. So we're able to get a lens both into the pollution side as well as into the firm production side. And that's something that's really hard to do, even in the US and other contexts, particularly kind of putting everything together is really difficult. And so the wealth of Chinese administrative data gives us a great opportunity to do that.
Hey, Fiona, do you want to talk just a little bit more about how this fits in with your other research? And in some sense, it's a little bit disruptive to what your research plans were, and why you were willing to engage with that disruption? And, you know, would you have been able to do this anywhere else?
Yeah, totally. So the majority of my work is on electricity and electricity markets. So I am doing research now on electric vehicles in California, as well as a lot of stuff on rural energy access and ways to improve supply of electricity in India, where their problems facing the Indian setting are very different than the problems facing the Chinese setting. China has had full electrification for a really long time. In India, there are still big challenges keeping the financial health of the electricity system sound, so getting people to actually pay their bills in a way that these are challenges that sort of aren't really facing the Chinese population. But when I got to EPIC, I sort of always been interested in working in China, but not really had a good way to get my foot in the door. I haven't managed to make it out to Beijing yet, but one of the things I'm really excited about with the establishment of the center is being able to actually have a place on the ground where I can visit and engage with local policymakers, because I think that's a super important part of doing this type of research. It's, I think, foolhardy for me to sit in my office in Chicago and pretend that I know something about China, when instead I can come and visit and actually interact and talk with people. And having had the opportunity to do that based out of the Delhi Center in India has really allowed me to grow my research portfolio in the Indian electricity sector in ways that I just wouldn't have been able to do without that support. So I'm super enthusiastic about doing similar things in China. And it seems like starting to work on economic impacts of pollution abatement is a perfect place to get in the game.
Terrific. So I think Xiaoda is going to do this without video to conserve the bandwidth. Is that right, Xiaoda?
Okay. Yeah. Very sorry about the connection issue. So I'm going to talk about a project related to citizen participation and environmental regulation in China. So this is a collaboration among multiple institutions, which involves Michael, Goju, and myself, which are all affiliated with the EPIC-UCAS Joint Center. Okay, next. Oh, cool. So the main research question we want to ask in this project is that, we want to understand whether increasing citizen participation could help improve environmental regulation quality in China. The context is that in China, we have this continuous emissions monitoring system, which covers more than 20,000 polluting plants across the country. So automatic monitors are installed in those heavy polluters, and their emission information is collected in real time and publicized on the internet so everyone can see that. So what we do in this project is that we write some code to automatically identify those environmental violations based on the real-time emission data. And then we, the research team, randomly make appeals about those environmental violations to the government. And when we make these appeals, we also vary the content and the extent of the content of our appeals. Okay, next slide. Okay, cool. So just to be a little bit more specific, so we randomize these interventions at the firm level, right? So some firms are assigned to a control group, meaning that when these firms violate emission standards, we don't do anything about them. We don't make any appeals. And then all the other firms are assigned to various different treatment groups. And in the experiment, we have 6 different interventions, but in the interest of time, I'll just talk about the first 3. And so some firms are assigned to a first group called a information treatment. So what we do here is that when the firm violates emission standards, we just tell the government in private, saying that, we have noticed this environmental violation, but we don't make any complaint. And then in the second arm, we have a private complaint. So what we do here is that when these firms violate emission standards, we tell the government through a website platform called 12369, which is a government complaint platform, saying that, we noticed the environmental violation, please do something about it. Please resolve the issue. So it's a complaint made to the government, but it's private. So only us, the researchers, and the government can see that, and other people cannot see the complaint. So that's a private complaint. And we also have a third intervention, which is a public complaint. So what we do here is that we make a complaint about the environmental violation on Weibo, which is a popular social media like the Chinese Twitter. And we post on Weibo that, we noticed this environmental violation, and we add the official account of the corresponding government branch. And we say, please do something about it. Please resolve the issue. So that's a public complaint. Everyone on that platform can see the complaint. Okay, next slide. Okay, so here we can visualize, what effects our interventions have on environmental outcomes. So here, what we care about is, whether when we appeal about environmental violations of certain firms, these firms will be less likely to violate environmental standards in the future. So the outcome variable here is future likelihood of environmental violations. And all those effects are in comparison to the control group where we do nothing. So as we can see in the first row, so when we just inform the government in private about environmental violations, there is basically very limited effect on future likelihood of environmental violations. And as you can see in the second column, when we make private appeals about environmental violations of these firms, that private appeal is essentially the same as just information. It has limited effect on reducing future likelihood of environmental violations. But importantly, in the third row, as you can see, when we make a public complaint on the social media platform, it has a very significant effect in terms of reducing the firm's future likelihood of having environmental violations. Because the treatment and the control groups are randomly assigned, these results suggest that public pressure could really be very effective in incentivizing the government to better enforce environmental regulation programs. Okay, next slide. Okay, and in terms of trying to better understand the underlying mechanisms, so when we make those complaints, when we make those appeals, we also randomize the content of the appeals. So in some cases, as you can see in the second row, in some cases, we will tell the local government when we make the appeals, please resolve the issue. If you do not resolve the issue, we may bring the issue to popular media. But as you can see, this intervention is not effective at all in terms of, in the sense that it did not increase the response rate of the government to our complaint. But as you can see in the third row, in some cases, we tell the government, please resolve the issue. If you do not resolve the issue, we'll keep appealing about the violation, maybe to upper level governments. And as you can see in the third row, this is actually quite effective. When we make threats like this, we get a much higher response rate from the government. But most importantly, as we can see from the first row, right, in some cases, we don't make any threats, but we just make the Weibo post, the social media post, much more visible to other people by randomly increasing the number of retweets, the number of likes of this appeal posts. And as you can see, when the social media complaint is much more visible, the government is much more likely to respond to this appeal and to regulate these firms. So in the actual project, we have a lot more other interventions. In the interest of time, I won't be talking about them, but hopefully, this very brief introduction could give you an idea of some of the projects that we're involved in, and also, hopefully, because the Chinese government has been trying to make environmental protection more transparent and get more citizens involved in the process. So hopefully, some of the findings could shed a little bit more light on how to proceed towards that direction. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Xiaoda. Shada, before we turn to Jungbo, I just wanted to, if you could give the audience some perspective on what you're trying to do kind of writ large with your wide set of research projects, and maybe just zoom out a little bit from this individual project, because I think people will be interested in that.
Sure. So I work at the intersection of political economy and environmental economics. So basically, my main agenda is trying to understand like the effectiveness of various environmental regulation programs, and how to better design the program to make it more consistent with the incentives of the local officials, so that these programs can be better enforced.
Terrific. And do you see what's the path to finding a way to interact with policymakers? Or maybe you already are, or what role do you think that this research being conducted by you and other people at the Joint Center, how can that interact with policymakers? And of course, I'm going to ask Jungbo a similar question, but it'd be interesting to get your perspective.
Yeah, so I think in that perspective, the EPIC-UCAS Joint Center is very important in the sense that I think in local governance in China, people respect scientists a lot, and that's like the comparative advantage of UCAS. So this center really provides us a platform to engage a lot with the policymakers and the people who actually enforce these policies, and to bring some of the evidence that we find in our research and to try to integrate that into like future policy design.
I think it's natural now to turn to Jungbo, and maybe you could talk a little bit about the formation of the Joint Center, kind of looking back, but also really looking forward. What do you hope it will look like in 5 years? I think people will be very interested in that. And maybe you can even connect that to some of the very ambitious goals that China's leadership has set with respect to energy environmental policy.
Oh, yes, thank you, Mac. First of all, I would like to say a few sentences to answer like Fianna's talk about the possibility, the chance to work with UCAS or the CAS professors or scientists. There's a big news I'd like to share with you. There's a science city called Huairou Science City, which is I believe in scale is 5 times bigger than the organizational level, because I was working at the organizational level. I know how big it is. The Huairou Science City, which is just by the campus of UCAS, is 5 times bigger than that. And within the science city, there is a national energy lab of China, located in the city. Lots of chance waiting for us, waiting for our joint center and for all our professors to work together with them. As long as the COVID-19, if the COVID-19 crisis is over, there are really many chances to work in this area through the UCAS, through our joint center. And I hope, like in 5 years later, whenever people are talking about the energy and the environment policy, they will mention something created by our joint center. No matter it's seminars, meeting, or conference, when people talk about or any policy related to energy or related to the environmental, they will mention something, some result come out of the UCAS and the EPIC Joint Center for Policy Research in China.
That's terrific. And now, can I just get you to talk a little bit more about, and we all share that goal. And now you just made this big announcement. I want to make sure I understood it about 5 times larger than argon.
Yeah, that's real. You know,
you can explain that a little bit more.
Yeah, we have 27 large-scale facilities built in the science city in Huairou. It's actually about 2 kilometers away from our campus, from the UCAS campus. For example, our there's photo source. The new generation photo source is, we have an APS in Argonne at Argonne National Lab, but the new one is under construction in Huairou City. Is 2 orders brighter than compared to APS in Argonne. And for those kind of facilities, there are 21 in the list. They're going to be built. Right now, they start like 7 in year 2018, 11 or in 2019, 11 in 2020, and the rest of it start this year. So in 5 years, I believe more than 80% of those facilities will be available to our scientists, to our professors. And UCAS is deeply involved in almost all the projects in the science city. UCAS, actually people here are talking about, we have UCAS first, then we have the science city. So this university, our university is really, really deeply involved in all the projects built in the Huaizhou Science City. We almost have everything. And also, China just announced the first group of national lab. There are 4 national labs. One of them is National Energy Lab, which will locate in this area, in the Huairou City. As I say, it's just 2 kilometers away from the UCAS campus. So whenever it's possible, everybody here, all our friends from the University of Chicago pretty much welcome to visit UCAS. And I will show you everything in the science city. It's really exciting, very exciting.
All right, we're very excited. Now, one of the things that I think is so great about the partnership is that you guys have all this technical expertise in the sciences and engineering, and we bring kind of the social science or economics. Now, will there be room for the economists in Science City? That's what I can tell from Fiona's face. She's worried about that.
Yeah, of course. There are big rooms, a lot of space for us to do, a lot of sense for us to do. China right now has the biggest problem to face the challenges of energy and the environmental. As I mentioned earlier, those problems, energy problems or environment problems, are usually not only the technical problems. More often, you will say it's policy problem, it's a regulation problem, it's law problems. So there's a lot of things to do. And in China, not so far, not many people have paid enough attention to this work. So our joint center can play big roles in this field.
So that is really kind of our starting point too, is that there are opportunities to better achieve the environmental goals and the economic goals by finding policies that maybe have a lighter touch or rely on markets a little bit more. There's a couple questions here. I wanted to just pass them out to the team, to the panelists here. So, Xiaoda, there's a question for you. Could you give an example of an environmental policy in China and the role of, if I'm following the question right, the role of incentives for, I guess, the enforcement authorities, and ideas you might have about ways to improve the incentives to provide better environmental performance?
Yeah, sure. So for example, in my doctoral dissertation, so we studied the policy on like surface water regulation in China. So what we found is that in the old days, like when the Chinese government used to monitor water quality using a lot of water monitoring stations that are located along the major river trunks, what happens is that the local officials have very strong incentives to increase the reading of those water quality monitoring stations. So what they do is that they spend a lot of efforts trying to regulate firms that are immediately in the upstream of those monitoring stations, but they don't pay as much attention in terms of regulating firms in the immediate downstream of those monitoring stations, because the readings of the station could reflect mostly the upstream pollution rather than the downstream pollution. So that creates a spatial discontinuity in environmental regulation stringency. So in terms of, better designing the policy, we could think of having more continuous monitor along the river, either by like building a lot more monitoring stations so that every place is in some sense an upstream area, or like some other interesting policies that China has been doing. For example, we now have this so-called river chief policy in China, where like each local bureaucrat is in charge of a small trunk of the river, so that whenever that part of the river is polluted, that person is personally held accountable. So this also solves some of the so-called principal agent problem in terms of monitoring.
Okay, excellent. Fiona, there's a question for you. You spoke a little bit about your experience working in India. The person who's asking the question is wondering, and actually this is really a question, I think, for all three panelists, I see it clearly. Do you guys think that the work that the Joint Center and EPIC China will be doing, it surely, since it's happening in China, will be useful for Chinese policymakers? Could it be useful for policymakers in other parts of the world? And what are the things we should be doing to make sure that that information is action relevant, I guess, for other parts of the world? So Fiona, do you want to start
with that? Yeah. No, I think that's a great question. So I think I sort of see my role as generating two types of insights, right? One is specific numbers relevant to a specific place that can really help local policymakers improve things given a particular context. And then the second piece is generating generalizable insight that we can take and sort of put elsewhere, and also to understand what things generalize and what doesn't, right? So in a lot of my work, I'm really thinking carefully about how to translate lessons we've learned in the electricity sector in the United States into the Indian context, where some of the institutions are the same. We have electric utilities and we have consumers and we have power plants. And some things are very different. There are different norms around bill payment, for example. And so I think it's an exciting opportunity to understand what translates and what doesn't. And I think that Chinese policies give us a similar opportunity. There are definitely going to be some things about them that are specific to the set of firms that exist in China and the production practices that currently exist. But I think there are also lessons about kind of blunt instruments versus market-based instruments that also have the potential to translate into other places as well.
So Fiona, just do you want to just expand a little bit on what's a blunt instrument and what's a market-based instrument?
Yeah, so in this context of the pollution alert system, if you have a very high polluting day, the government is essentially asking the majority of industry within a given city to shut down for the day. That's obviously a large cost to the economy. And so what you might imagine doing instead is providing a price incentive to say, hey, if you're a very heavily polluting firm, we're going to make it super expensive for you to produce today. But if you're a more efficient firm in that same industry, and you can produce at a sort of a lower level of emissions, we might actually prefer for you, the firm, to stay on while your kind of bad polluting neighbor is turned off, right? We can try and do that in a command and control way, but that requires the government knowing a lot about every single firm and really taking an active role in shutting firm A down and not firm B. Whereas if instead we put in, for example, a pollution tax or a price on pollution on these really heavy emitting days, what that might instead do is actually incentivize the firms to make their own decisions, shut off the plant that produces a lot of pollution and keep the low emission plant running, right? And so what we're trying to do is find what I like to think of as kind of cheap solutions to environmental challenges. Market-based instruments have been shown elsewhere. Michael's work, for example, in the US suggests that this is the case, to help us find the cheapest possible answer to some of these big challenges.
Okay, great. And actually, I think that's an important theme of really all of our work through EPIC China. So Zhangbo, there's a question I think you, perfect person to answer. The Ministry of Ecology and Environment of China requires that in the future, China will insist on carbon reductions as the overall starting point in order to force economic restructuring and high quality development and ultimately achieve synergies with the improvement of ecological environmental quality. So I think that's like a great frame. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that, or what you think that means for the kind of research that should be done at the Joint Center, or I think people would benefit from hearing your reactions.
Yeah, actually, we all know the problem we're having right now, and we just need to find out the right solution. And also, the most important thing is any solution we give out will be a little easier to be accepted by the people outside. For China, the government always sets some goals. For most people, if they're well educated, it's much easier for them to accept, to work together with the management. For some people, if they're living, if they didn't get enough education, they sometimes a little bit difficult for them to understand what's happening. So whenever we try to do something, to tell people to follow some regulations, follow some rules, or to accept some solution, it will be a little bit difficult. That's something we need to work a little bit more. Back to just what I heard from Vienna, I believe we have very similar situation sometimes in India and in China. What you learn from your study in India will be very helpful to China, I believe. So whenever you have a chance, you're very much welcome to China. The state grade play a big role in the national energy lab. I would like to introduce you to those partners. You might have a chance to work with them together.
Okay, thank you. Listen, let me just say, we're all dying for the vaccine so we can get to China and start working together more closely. That will be an exciting day when we can all get together. And it's a shame that we're not able to do this in person today. So let me just thank the panelists and now turn it over to Sam, my colleague Sam Morey, who is our host, and say thank you all. But Sam, take it away.
Yeah, I'll just echo that and offer my sincere thanks to all the panelists. This was a terrific discussion, and we really appreciate it. I want to invite all of our attendees to join the upcoming anniversary event. This is a series. There are events throughout this month. The next event is Chemistry, a Tool for Understanding Human Health. It will take place on Tuesday evening, January 26th. Chicago time, Wednesday morning, January 27th in China. And I'm sure it will be a terrific discussion. So please join the university for that. And with that, I'm also going to sign off and just again say thank you to all of our panelists and thanks to all of our participants and those of you who joined us today for this discussion.